Well, thank you very much for your very kind introduction and the introduction to the other colleagues on this panel. It's a great honor for me to be able to speak to colleagues and students in Mexico. And I'll try and bring a different perspective to those that you may have heard in the earlier sessions, but I cannot promise there will be anything significantly different in terms of what I want to talk about. Um, could I just start by saying that the theme of my talk is connected to the question of organic crisis. It's something that I will try and define as we go along, as well as particular approaches to and definitions of global governance. I'll try and offer a problematique that we can use to approach such issues in what today I would call is a global or a planetary organic crisis. Um, then I'll try and raise some scenarios concerning the future. This is really a series of questions as opposed to answers. It's a way of posing questions. And I'm very keen to hear what Mexican colleagues have to say about some of these issues and raised in their presentations or responses. And then asking what could governance be in the future, contingent upon those scenarios. What I try to do is to raise some of the main issues that I think are relevant. One I would call the hegemonic crisis of global leadership, which is dramatized partly by the clashes, the rivalries between the United States and China, and struggles over the future, which are connected to their particular development and political models and their geopolitical positions. Perhaps a few things raised about Mexico and Canada, since we have issues in common with respect to our relationship to the United States, and what kind of alternatives and prospects for different forms of governance at the national and perhaps the global level are connected to those questions. And then I want to raise what would be a rhetorical question, which I think applies to everyone really in a way, is whether the capitalism, particularly capitalism as we know it, whether it is the problem or the solution to governance questions in the foreseeable future. And if so, what kinds of capitalism would go with a sustainable, just, and a more dignified form of world order and global governance in the future? And then I want to raise issues concerning what could be these alternatives. And one that I think may not have occurred to many people is one that was first raised by Antonio Gramsci in the 1930s when he talked about the modern prince. And I think we can use that concept to look at some of the issues today. Let's call it a postmodern prince, or more accurately, postmodern princess, because it's not something that is simply a political form or a political movement that is led by men. It's also men and women together across the globe. So these are the issues I want to touch on. I may not be able to get through all of them very well in 20 minutes, but we'll see where we can go. So let's start with conceptualizing organic crisis. My conception draws on Gramsci's reading of the 1930s, where he used the now very well-known phrase. It was a world when he was incarcerated by the Italian fascists, where he wrote in his notebooks, "The old is dying and the new cannot yet be born." And we lived in an interregnum in which many morbid symptoms arise. So Gramsci was conceptualizing the situation in the 1930s, which I think we can begin to look at as a way, as a lens towards approaching our contemporary situation. But the period he saw as the 1930s was one of deep instability and conflict, crises of political representation, the undermining of prevailing ideologies of authority and governance, and support for traditional political parties was collapsing. And particular events such as the 1929 stock market crash emanating from the United States tipped the world into a great recession, and support for far-right parties, fascist and Nazi parties, as well as left-wing communist forces began to grow. However, that decade, 30s, bookended by the First World War and then the Second World War, produced the most lethal conflict in history. So I think it's a salutary example. So let's try and relate that to some definitions of global governance. Now, this is something which I'm sure that has been endlessly debated in this conference, but there is an abstract definition. It involves public and private forces, mechanisms, and ideas that justify, legitimate, and seek to stabilize power and influence, and institutionalize those patterns with incentives and sanctions to try and generate compliance across different jurisdictions. However, what is historical? What is global governance today? Well, it is something that is basically determined and has been historically determined by configurations of world power and world orders, be they hegemonic or imperial formations. And today we have a post-Cold War capitalist world order, and its governance institutions seek to reinforce and police a world order which is premised upon the primacy of capital, the world market, and United States geopolitical power as key governing forces of world politics. And of course, that's recently been challenged by China and to a lesser extent the BRICS, as the world order undergoes some changes. So what it is an order that promotes policies and regulations for a neoliberal governing model, which I call disciplinary neoliberalism, and it seeks to extend a consumerist but ecologically myopic capitalist market civilization, which is not available to all the world's population, but to privileged minorities, particularly in the wealthier parts of the world, the OECD countries, and to a lesser extent elsewhere. It is actually also practiced in China. But the long-term logic of this is ecologically destructive, it's socially divisive, and it lacks legitimacy. So these are components of the problematic that I wish to raise, which is that of global or planetary organic crisis. Now, Gramsci was talking mainly about European politics in the 1930s, after the First World War and the Russian Revolution, and was looking at the world as it began to grow in its propensity to extreme violence and fascism and Nazism in particular. But however, that crisis centered in Europe was global in its ramifications. It encompassed the other great powers, UK, the USA, and Japan, and it led to World War II. So we can apply this to a certain extent today, which involve, as they did in the 30s, struggles between the old and the radically new. We see crises of representation and challenges to the self-evidence of the age, to prevailing forms of governance and so-called common sense assumptions of business as usual. And what does business as usual mean? Well, it largely means that ruling forces are sustaining an ecologically myopic and unequal pattern of development, sometimes called sustainable development, although the question is sustainable of what and for whom. And it has unique existential as well as ecological qualities, which are endangering the biosphere and indeed the social reproduction of life forms on our planet. So that's looking at good governance from a critical perspective. And of course, the question is, what are the contexts here? What have been the immediate context in the present conjuncture, which have led to the intensification of morbid symptoms, which reflect the organic crisis? Well, first of all, obviously, there has been a decline of the traditional left after the collapse of the USSR. There's been increasing conflicts over the governance of the global financial crisis and the recent COVID pandemic. This has compounded political conflicts. And there are some particular features which seem to be global in nature, accelerating public and private debts, the privatization and the defunding of social provisioning worldwide, ongoing dispossession of communities and public goods versus hyper concentrations of private wealth, a world that is characterized by the extended global power of capital, dominated by corporate monopolies such as big data, media, big pharma, energy and fossil fuels, agribusiness, locked in by trade and investment agreements and other measures, which I call new constitutionalism. It's the primary form of economic governance at the world level. Particular things which have caused flashpoints in recent years have been what could be called greedflation. That is, inflation which seems to go with attempts by capitalist firms to jack up prices and make the cost of living very, very difficult for ordinary people as profits are soaring, whereas governments have done very little to try and contain this. And governance seems to be increasingly associated with plutocratic governance, very, very rich people who are linked in many cases to far-right reactionary nationalism and neoliberal authoritarianism, practicing a culture war on the left. And generally speaking, the ecological picture is one of degradation, species extinction, denialism of climate change and its impacts. We're all guinea pigs now. We eat food that has GMOs, toxic chemicals, frankenfoods. It's creating obesity in many parts of the world, particularly in countries that follow the US-style market civilization models of hyper-consumerism. So what does this create? Well, I call it the hegemonic crisis of global leadership. And this has been going on for a long time, long before the most recent election victory of President Trump. And it seems to have been connected to what we might call two rival political parties in a culture and strategic war with each other to control the major institutions and practices of governance at the world level. The most obvious one is that spearheaded by Donald Trump. He challenges the traditional post-war strategy of the United States, which was based on neoliberal governance and integral capitalist alliances. And he seeks a more supremacist strategy of global dominance, using threats and authoritarian alliances, drawing some support, it's important to say, from alienated fractions of populations who are dissatisfied with the status quo. And they are linked to a far right, which is a transnational social and cultural movement. It has its own, in a sense, its own international political party, its own far right internationalism, international, should I say, which one of my doctoral students calls far right civilizationism. And they oppose the so-called rules-based liberal international economic order, which I just referred to as new constitutionalism. And the figures will be well known to everybody here, so I don't need to list those people. But both they, sorry, should I say? So these two flanks, these two elements, one that champions the so-called rules-based system and the far-right civilizational model, still wish to support neoliberal capitalist market civilization and consumerism, which is at the heart of the problems connected to the ecological question. And they both wish to constrain Chinese power. So let's look at some scenarios that stem from this situation. Well, first of all, we'll focus on the United States versus China. And obviously, this will reshape global governance in enormously significant ways. China is a supporter of rules-based multilateralism, and so is the European Union, because it it's so reliant upon international trade and globalization. And of course, it's opposed to Trump's um, unilateralism in trade, etc., and what the Chinese call his bullying over tariffs and immigration. Whereas Trump is much more transactional. He's leaning towards a more autarkic, neo-mercantilist position. Um, and obviously, he sees China as a threat as opposed to an opportunity for further development of the interests represented by the United States. So both of these two very significant powers, the dominant power of the United States and the rival rising power of China, have challenges in terms of their ability to be able to shape the future. I mean, the first thing that needs to be raised is whether Donald Trump, after his election, has actually destroyed Trumpism, because it's not clear that the policies that he's begun to push very aggressively are having the desired effects. It's not clear that he's recruited people to his administration who are significantly competent to carry out the tasks at hand. They are loyalists to Trump, but they may not be capable leaders. And the US is grappling with huge public debts. It basically lives off the rest of the world in many respects, running consistent deficits. It's a country where there is rising inequality and growing internal divisions and conflicts. There is a significant loss of investor confidence in the United States economy as a global reserve currency. It doesn't inspire the three C's that investors are looking for, which is basically confidence in the way that the United States will run its affairs, consistency in American policy, and credibility that its promises, its policies will be sustainable and will be kept. So these are real problems for the United States. And since Donald Trump has begun to attack traditional American state institutions and practices, it has been alleged that he's squandering what Joseph Nye called soft power. It's soft power. In my terminology, it's hegemonic institutions, its ability to create consent, to incorporate allies from the rest of the world. And it's undermining its key assets in science, in knowledge, its primary alliances, which are all needed, really, if it wishes to constrain a powerful and able China. So those are key challenges, and they're mainly internal to the United States. Most of the rest of the world does not wish to make the United States an enemy, but Donald Trump is conducting policy which is certainly raising questions on their part as to whether it is or it is not. Now, China does have similar challenges. It needs to try to expand its hegemonic appeal. It's focusing that on globalization and the rules-based order. But unfortunately, it also is suffering from a crisis of overproduction. It is the world's workshop. It has a $1 trillion annual trade surplus, and just about every state in the world has a huge trade deficit with China. The Chinese economy needs exports as a vent for this surplus. The question is, can the rest of the world absorb these surpluses? So that's a contradictory issue for the world economy, because the Chinese would have to provide resources for its world order strategies and to reshape global governance. But there are limits to its capacities to maintain green growth. Of course, it uses a great deal of fossil fuels to fuel its activities. It needs to try to consistently continue to promote internal redistribution and its knowledge-based accumulation strategies as it goes up the ladder of technical feasibility, and to exploit the opportunities that have been opened up by Trump's strategic errors. Both of these dominant governance projects rely on neoliberal governance with different degrees of authoritarian practices and leadership. They both are reliant upon extractivist industries and huge use of fossil fuels for development. Each is therefore contradicting ecological sustainability, and it's deepening the climate problems. They are hastening the demise of what the scientists call the post-Anthropocene world, and hastening the destruction of key aspects of the biosphere. Now, whilst China is attempting to go green in its development strategies, it's still heavily reliant upon fossil fuels. So they both need to respond to a series of contradictions, economic, health, and ecological, partly because they are linked to this consumerist market civilization model, which is energy intensive and uses a great deal of resources, as well as they are coping with trying to gain leadership and control over the so-called fourth industrial revolution of digital innovations, which is a very, very complex task. So all of these scenarios, whatever they may be, will have to take account of and deal with the impact, for example, of these ecological forces, particularly climate change, the forces of technology, and especially artificial intelligence, which will cause a major restructuring of geopolitics, the global economy. Particular forms of state will change, the role of labor and patterns of social reproduction. It's a kind of known unknown, which is incredibly difficult and complex to absorb. So impacts are really about how we would grapple with these questions in the future. And one of them, of course, is a question that occasionally surfaces a great deal in the media, which is whether we're moving towards a post-human world. Can we keep artificial intelligence, etc., and other of these forces under human and democratic control? So how do Mexico and Canada stand in this? Well, their scenarios, governance, are overdetermined by their external economic and to a certain extent cultural relationships with the United States. Mexico, 85% of its exports go to the US. It had to concede changes to its 1917 constitution to make it initially compatible into NAFTA, and then subsequent trade and investment agreements with Canada and the United States. It had to liberalize its trade and investment along new constitutional lines. And similarly, Canada is 75% of Canada's exports go to the US. So both countries are in this overdetermined situation, and they export very little to China. So that pathway may not be fully available to them. They've managed to try and sustain their sovereign leadership in this situation. And hopefully, I would say they still will, and negotiate whatever they can with American initiatives on these crucial issues of trade and investment. So it's very difficult to know how far they would be able to diversify their options and how these might change, particularly if there is growing domestic opposition to Donald Trump, and his supporters are not re-elected in sufficient numbers to Congress. This is something I'd like to hear more of from the Mexican colleagues on the panel. So is capitalism the problem or the solution? This is an important question because we live in a capitalist world order, and its governance is going to be connected to capitalism, I think, one way or the other. We can't wish it away. The question is which forms of capitalism. China and the US both represent forms of authoritarian neoliberal capitalism. But that's not the only alternative or alternatives that exist, because there are many different forms of capitalism. Nazism and fascism were capitalist. China is a communist-ruled capitalism. Different capitalisms exist across Latin America. Mexico and Brazil tend to have kind of a left orientation, whereas Argentina, El Salvador, and Ecuador lean towards the Trump views of the right. The Nordic models are different to other parts of Europe, and so on. So there are different models, and some are more egalitarian, Some have better public services, education, and democracy, and worker representation than others. Finland being a good example of that, and it's a very innovative and successful society. So, what model of the future can serve to provide progressive governance in the future is a question that I think is crucial. And again, I'd like to hear ideas from other panelists on this question.
Sorry, Dr. Gill, we are running out of time. If you could make your closure.
I'll just finish now then. So what I've tried to do is to describe this organic crisis. And the last concept I wanted to introduce, not because Mexico is led by a woman, but I call it the postmodern princess. It's grounded in Machiavelli's idea of the prince and Gramsci's the modern prince, and it seeks to conceptualize the real and imagined aspects of progressive politics and political agency in the postmodern era. So I think it would be one that focuses on good social policy, questions of equity and human security, and tries to make sure that we don't simply reduce economic questions to power and production, but also what feminists call social reproduction and eco-sustainability. I think there is plenty of evidence that there are forces throughout the world, very intelligent people, scientists, medical people, doctors, as well as young people throughout the world that want to see forms of governance that embody these projects connected to generally benefiting humankind and biospheric sustainability. So the idiom that I would use for this is the postmodern princess. It would leave behind the abandonment of science, rationality, and evidence for knowledge which is useful, forward-looking, and would not become a rogue state such as the United States, which seems to be now attempting to attack climate science, because we need all of that knowledge and those social forces to understand the way that these things are moving, lest we lose sight of what lies inevitably ahead. Thank you very much.